Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a chapter all about behavior modification and specifically stimulus control in applied behavior analysis, or ABA. Now, before we get too far, I want to assure our listeners that we're not going to get bogged down with a ton of technical jargon. Instead, we'll break down these concepts in a way that's easy to understand and relatable. Think of it like this. Have you ever noticed how you just automatically stop at a red light or you answer your phone when it rings? Well, that's stimulus control at work.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much our surroundings really do shape our behavior, often without us even realizing it.
It's true. And this chapter jumps right in with a simple example to illustrate this. A boy named Jackson, who always asks his mom for money, but never asks his dad.
That's a classic example. It highlights how stimulus control works. You see, Jackson has learned that asking mom for money is usually successful. She reinforces that behavior by giving him the money. Dad, on the other hand, doesn't reinforce that behavior, so Jackson is less likely to ask him.
So in a way, mom's presence becomes like a cue or trigger for Jackson's money-asking behavior.
Exactly. And that's really the essence of stimulus control. This increased probability of a behavior happening in the presence of a specific, what we call antecedent stimulus. Think of it like this. A red light is a stimulus that makes it very likely you're going to hit the brakes. It doesn't force you to stop, but it's a very strong signal that you probably should stop.
So it's not just about blindly responding to every little thing in our environment.
Right. Our past experiences and the consequences of our actions really play a huge role in how we respond.
Totally.
It's all about learning those associations, between stimuli behaviors and consequences. I bet you can think of a few behaviors that you only do in certain situations.
Oh, absolutely. Like I only sing at the top of my lungs when I'm in the shower.
I think that's probably for the best. But it goes to show that even something as simple as singing can be under stimulus control. Now, this chapter digs deeper into how we actually learn this stimulus control through something called stimulus discrimination training.
Stimulus discrimination training. That sounds kind of intense, like separating the sheep from the goats.
Well, not quite that dramatic. Think of it like learning to read. Each letter on the page is like a discriminative stimulus, or SD. Saying the correct sound for that letter is the behavior, and getting praise from the teacher is the reinforcement.
So we learn which cues lead to good things and which ones don't.
Exactly. And the chapter talks about this really interesting study by Holland and Skinner. They taught pigeons to peck a key, but only when a red light was on. If a green light was on, no pecking.
So the red light was like the signal?
It was the signal. They called it the SD. And they used food to reinforce the pecking when that red light was on. But when the green light was on, which they called the S delta, pecking got no food, the pigeons learned to discriminate between the lights pretty quickly.
That's pretty cool. So this discrimination training is all about picking up on those subtle cues that tell us if our actions are going to pay off or not.
Yeah.
And it's not always about rewards either, right?
Yeah.
The chapter also mentions punishment.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They give the example of accidentally tasting boiling soup. That burning sensation is a very effective punisher.
Yeah, you learn pretty quickly not to do that again.
It teaches us to avoid that unpleasant consequence. So stimulus control is shaped by both positive and negative reinforcement, as well as punishment.
So we're constantly learning from our experiences, both good and bad. And our brains are always weighing the costs and benefits of what we do.
Exactly. Which brings us to a core concept in ABA, the three-term contingency. You might hear it called the ABCs of behavior. Antecedent behavior consequence.
Okay, I like that ABCs analogy.
It's a good one. And this chapter really stresses how crucial it is to understand that these three elements are always linked.
So the antecedent is the trigger or cue. The behavior is the action itself. And the consequence is what happens as a result. Like if a child raises their hand after the teacher asks a question and then gets praised for participating.
Perfect example. The praise reinforces the hand raising, making it more likely to happen again.
That makes sense.
That's the whole idea behind the three-term contingency. It's a framework for understanding why we do what we do and how to influence behavior.
That's so interesting how a simple framework like that can be so powerful, like a decoder ring for the human mind. But the chapter doesn't stop there. It also brings up this idea of generalization.
Generalization, that's a fun one. It's like when you teach your dog to fetch the newspaper and then he starts bringing you every piece of junk mail in the yard.
Yeah. Why does that happen?
Well, generalization is when a behavior we've learned in one situation starts to occur in other similar situations, even if they're not exactly the same. Think about learning to drive a car with a manual transmission.
Mm.
Once you learn, you can generally drive any car with a manual transmission.
Right, even though each car's a little different.
Exactly. But like with your dog, it can lead to some unintended and sometimes not so desirable outcomes.
That's true.
The chapter actually highlights this study where, unfortunately, a child's head-hitting behavior was accidentally reinforced by adult attention. And sadly, that behavior generalized to any adult, not just the ones who initially gave the attention.
Oh, wow.
This really underscores why understanding generalization is crucial, especially for ABA professionals.
They need to be really careful how they design interventions so that the behaviors they're trying to teach generalize to the appropriate situations.
Exactly. They don't want those behaviors happening in places where they could cause problems.
Right. It's like walking a tightrope.
And it gets even more interesting when we start talking about stimulus equivalence. All right, so are you ready to have your mind blown with stimulus equivalence?
Oh, I'm strapped in and ready for the mind-bending stuff. Last time we talked about how we learn to discriminate or differentiate between different cues. But what happens when things that seem totally different actually represent the same concept in our minds? That's where this whole stimulus equivalence thing comes in, right?
Exactly. It's like our brains are creating these shortcuts, connecting things that might not seem related at first glance based on their shared meaning. Like the chapter dives into this example. Imagine a kid learning that a picture of a car and the spoken word car all represent the same thing.
Oh, that makes sense.
So even though these stimuli are completely different, one's visual, one's auditory, one's written, they all trigger the same understanding in the brain.
It's like our brain is saying, hey, those things might look and sound different, but they all mean the same thing.
Precisely. And this ability to form what we call equivalence classes is a real superpower of human cognition. The chapter goes on to explain these two super interesting phenomena, symmetry and transitivity. They kind of demonstrate how we learn without even realizing it.
Okay, break those down for me. Symmetry and transitivity sound a bit like something out of a geometry textbook.
Well, they do describe relationships, but instead of lines and angles, we're talking about relationships between stimuli. Let's say you teach a child to match the spoken word for dog to the written character for dog.
Okay, so they learn to associate the sound with that specific symbol.
Right. Now, with symmetry, the child can automatically reverse that relationship. They can match the written character back to the spoken word, even though you never specifically taught them that direction.
Wow, that's really interesting. So our brains make a two-way street of meaning.
And then transitivity takes us a step further. Let's say you now introduce a third element, a picture of a dog, and you teach the child to match the written character to the picture.
So now they've learned that the sound, the written character, and the image of a dog all represent the same thing.
Exactly.
So their brain is like connecting the dots, even though we only gave them a few to work with.
It's amazing how efficient our brains can be. And this is a big deal for learning language and understanding new concepts.
I can see that.
It's fundamental to our ability to think abstractly and to categorize things.
So it's more than just simple associations. It's about building these mental maps of how the world works.
Right, and that's why stimulus equivalence is super important in ABA. Therapists use these principles when designing interventions.
Can you give me an example of how that works?
Sure. Let's say an ABA therapist is working with a child who's learning to identify different fruits. They might use matching tasks where the child has to pair a picture of an apple with the written word apple.
So it's not just about naming the apple when they see it.
Right. It's about helping them create that equivalence class for apple, even though the stimuli look and sound different.
It's about connecting the dots between the word, the picture, and the actual object.
Exactly. And this approach can be used for so many things, not just teaching about fruits. It can be used for teaching basic skills, promoting communication, all sorts of things.
That's incredible. But even with something as powerful as stimulus equivalence,
Yeah.
I imagine there are challenges in applying these concepts in the real world.
Oh, absolutely. Human behavior is complex and unpredictable.
What are some of the challenges that come up?
Well, one of the biggest ones is making sure that behaviors generalize correctly. We talked about this earlier. Generalization can be a double-edged sword. We want those positive behaviors to occur in the appropriate situations, but we don't want them happening everywhere.
Right, like we don't want that dog bringing us dirty laundry.
Exactly. And finding that balance can be tricky. Sometimes behaviors generalize too broadly, leading to unintended consequences. Other times they don't generalize enough, which limits how helpful the intervention is.
So ABA professionals really need to think strategically about how they design interventions.
You need to be thoughtful. Choosing the right reinforcers, creating clear cues, and gradually fading out those prompts and supports to encourage independence.
It sounds like a delicate dance.
It is. It requires a deep understanding of the person, the environment, the challenges.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. And that's why ongoing assessment and data collection are so important in ABA. Professionals need to monitor progress, see what's working and what's not, and adapt their strategies as needed.
It's dynamic.
It is. It's all about finding what works best for each individual person.
That's so cool. It's inspiring to see how these principles can be used to help people.
It is a testament to the hard work of ABA professionals.
I can see why you're so passionate about this field.
It's fascinating. And on that note, I think we've covered a lot today. Hopefully you're feeling inspired.
I know I am. But before we wrap things up, let's leave our listeners with a question to think about. How can you use this understanding of stimulus control to create a more positive and supportive environment for yourself and the people around you? We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic.
Until next time, happy learning.